All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome in. A little bit of breaking news here, as I'm sure you've just got notifications across your various DawgNation platforms. Georgia has a quarterback for the 2025 recruiting cycle, and it is a name that, quite frankly, hasn't gotten a lot of chatter up until I think the last 2-3 days here, but it is still a name worth discussing. And a very interesting name. Georgia goes into Ohio. They beat out Florida. They beat out South Carolina to land Ryan Montgomery, 6'3", 215 pounds, number 15 overall quarterback in this class, number 184 overall ranked prospect. And there's no one I'd rather discuss this big news with than Jeff Sentell. So, Jeff, what is Georgia getting in Ryan Montgomery? How did Georgia end up with Ryan Montgomery? And what does this say about the Georgia quarterback situation and position and recruiting and everything moving forward?
Hey, Connor, I noticed, I don't know, you were probably following along like I was. Did you notice how this might be the first quarterback we've ever heard say for the next 3 to 5 years?
Taking the long view.
That's the way, Connor, honestly, and I'm just going to cut open a vein here and be totally real with folks. I think that's why Ryan Montgomery is your Georgia 2025 quarterback commitment. There's a story on DawgNation.com right now. I got a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff here to share, but here's something that I think even the great debatist Connor Riley would appreciate here. I know everybody wants controversy. Everybody wants to know, hey, what's this mean with Julian Lewis? Hey, what's this mean with Matt Zollers? There is some debate, and I realize it's a healthy debate about whether Julian Lewis was the best quarterback, Matt Zollers was the best quarterback, or Ryan Montgomery was the best quarterback. That's debatable. The recruiting rankings have both of those gentlemen ahead of Ryan. I feel that it's a much easier debate to look at which one is the best fit for Georgia. I think Georgia has reached the point, and I don't want to make it seem like it's pompous or elitist, but I think Georgia has reached the point where they don't have to bend to the whim of high school prospects. I think that Ryan is the best fit for Georgia because I heard him tell it to me months ago. He said, I don't mind waiting. I don't mind pulling Carson back because when it's my turn, the Georgia development machine will have me ready to play great football. He also said NIL's not a very big part of his decision. His older brother, Luke, was a All-American offensive lineman, and he goes and plays for Ohio State. So this family is very well versed with big boy recruiting. And big boy recruiting for Ryan Montgomery started in the summer after his 8th grade year when Jim Harbaugh extended him his first offer after a camp. You guys can believe in stars. You can believe in what Connor and I can say. But when Jim Harbaugh, we can call him a quarterback whisperer. Maybe we can call him a lot of other things. But Jim Harbaugh put his stamp on him going into his high school career before he played a season of high school football. The other thing I think that makes Ryan Montgomery such a really great fit for Georgia is I feel it's those guys that want to be at Georgia that succeed, especially at the quarterback position. Connor, we know it's a transient position. We know guys don't stick long. So when you hear Ryan Montgomery say for the next 3 to 5 years, that to me says he's bought in. I don't need to play right away. You don't need to show me starters reps after year 1 or I'll be out the door. He understands that for him, Ryan Montgomery's got to be the best football player he possibly can be in the year 2028 and not in the year 2025. I think Ryan gets every bit of that. And I know things will get hard at Georgia, and you have a prospect that's already coming in very wired to kind of combat a lot of those things people worry about with recruiting these days. I hear lots of people say, hey, man, I'm not going to focus on recruiting because it's all now highest bidder, or Georgia deserves to have the best quarterback out there. But with that best quarterback out there comes entanglements, and it's not very clean. There's going to be some choppy waters here. So I think Ryan, who said to me matter-of-factly, and I believed him, that I can wait 2 years, I can wait 3 years to play. And if it's at Georgia, I'm going to be happy there because that's where I want to be. And Connor, there's a lot of guys at Georgia that did great work for Georgia. Todd Monken even extended the offer for him. Mike Bobo does what Bobo does. You had more guys like Brandon Streeter. You had Gummy Van Gorder. All those guys did their job to help Georgia win this recruitment. Kirby Smart especially. But I think what it came down to is this was a program win for Georgia. And what I mean by that is Ryan Montgomery has been in Athens. He's seen how the sausage is made. He's seen the DNA of the program. He's seen dozens of NFL bodies killing each other during the week. And he's like, you know what? I want to be a part of that. If I have my druthers, it says I can do anything in college football. I want it to be at a place like Georgia. And that environment, the crucible of the Georgia football program, I think more than anything else secured this commitment.
The biggest reason that Ryan Montgomery is the quarterback for Georgia in this 2025 cycle right now is the word you said. It's fit. He fits this program. He fits what it looks for. He comes from a great athletic family up there in Ohio, multi-sport athlete. Is a guy that can do a lot of things. Is a guy that Georgia has a long-standing relationship. You mentioned Todd Monken recruiting him and offering him. It's important to point out, of the 2025 quarterbacks in the 2025 cycle, Georgia had been recruiting Montgomery even before, Dylan Raiola moves on elsewhere, and I think ramped up the impression that they needed and absolutely had to take someone in this 2025 class. When that offer was first made, heck, even before Dylan Raiola announced that he would no longer be attending the University of Georgia, Julian Lewis was a 2026 quarterback. And so this all quarterback recruiting has changed a lot from what Georgia had planned out doing months ago. And Ryan Montgomery had always been an option for Georgia. And I think, they obviously made a push to try and get Matt Zollers. I think, and we'll get into it here, I think they're still going to recruit JuJu Lewis. But I think they know what they had in Ryan Montgomery, and the willingness to see him come in, potentially sit and wait, grow and develop, like Stetson Bennett did, like Carson Beck did, like Gunnar Stockton is in the path of doing so right now. I think that's very attractive to Kirby Smart. And so because of that, because Montgomery checked all those boxes for Georgia, I think that's the big reason why he right now is ultimately a Georgia Bulldog. It was a recruitment they were able to win. They beat out Florida. They beat out South Carolina to go get him. And so moving this along, there are still a lot of questions I think that still need to be answered when it comes to this quarterback room moving forward for Georgia. Transfer portal, Jared Curtis, the 2026 command, how does this impact that? But I'll start with the big question that I do have to ask you here. We've talked a lot about JuJu Lewis and him and his recruitment and what he means. He's an in-state player, a 5-star prospect per the latest rankings update that I've seen. What does this commitment mean for JuJu Lewis and Georgia's recruitment of him moving forward?
Yep. Connor, I think that's the question you got to ask. I think that's what folks will focus on. And for me, I think it makes sure this recruitment would be on Georgia's terms. Like, the door would be open for JuJu to come in and say, and maybe that's another show in itself, Connor, for us to say, like, if Julian Lewis came in to compete with somebody and he chose Georgia and he's like, hey, let the best man win, I'm here to compete. Maybe that would be some image polishing for the way a lot of Georgia fans, unfortunately, look at this recruitment of Julian Lewis, as it's like a mercenary Wild West highest bidder recruitment. I've been told that, USC currently doesn't have the highest bid. So that's one thing there with Julian to consider. But I really feel like, Connor, what's happened here is Georgia has made its decision. I feel like Georgia got to a point that said, we're going to take the first guy that wants to commit to us. And Ryan Montgomery, man, you'll see in the DawgNation story, as nice as the Montgomery family could be with respect to Florida and South Carolina, Georgia was always the choice here. And they were really just kind of jockeying to find, going through due process to see if Georgia doesn't work out, where else it would be. Like I said earlier in our show, maybe the one thing I hope people glean from this discussion is that, the most talented quarterback in the country might not be the most likely to succeed at the University of Georgia. And I know that might get a couple of, like, you serious Clarks looking at me right there. But Connor, I think you understand what I'm talking about here. Is I think it takes a special person to be able to thrive and wait and endure at Georgia with the way they like to kind of battle test their quarterbacks. And I think what happened is the decision came, and it's really kind of funny. You kind of know a little bit throughout the years of how this works. It's kind of like, it's funny, Connor, how it all comes back to high school. It's like, I'm going to ask you out to the prom if you're going to say yes. But if you're not going to say yes, then I'm really not going to ask you out to the prom. Now, I know I'm not trying to get laughs there, Connor, but
no, I know very well what you're saying. As someone who asked that question and didn't know if they were going to get a yes, I certainly understand the mental gymnastics that go into that there.
But, like, what it is I think there came a point where Georgia was, like, ready to take the commitment there from Montgomery. And then they basically sit down, and the parents tell Ryan, and they all get together. They take a couple of days to weigh it, and they're like, man, let's go to Georgia. Done deal. And that's basically exactly what Ryan said, because, like I said, the quarterback position, Connor, is different. There's only one of them. Georgia can't rotate in waves of defensive linemen or outside linebackers or running backs to kind of have everybody happy with the rep count. And it takes a different sort. I think, Ryan, if you folks are just joining us with our reaction right now to Ryan Montgomery's decision, I think it was perfectly stated by saying very little when he said for the next 3 to 5 years. He's in it for the long run. He's not in it for short term. I better play right away. And again, that, my friend, is what I feel fits Georgia really well. I'll kind of say it again. I think Georgia and Julian Lewis are probably done. I'm going to never say never in the world of recruiting. I mean, Julian could just be like, all right, let's go, Huckleberry. I want to go compete with the best. And I think Georgia would welcome that commitment, but I don't think Georgia would make that sort of makes sort of a pivot from what Georgia does in terms of NIL and inducements and promises that they haven't had a chance to make. And they've won, what, 29 out of their last 31, 30 out of their last 31 games. They haven't lost a home game since 2019. I think what Georgia is working, and I think what Georgia is doing is working. And I think this Ryan Montgomery decision today kind of speaks very loudly that Georgia is going to continue to do the things that have got it to the top of the mountain in college football.
Yeah, look, and you can look at and Alabama's a different program, obviously. Like, Bryce Young was the number 1 ranked quarterback in his recruiting class. He came in and sat a year behind Mac Jones, and there were a lot of people that thought, oh, maybe Bryce Young should be the starting quarterback that year. Mac Jones was a national championship, and he's the last Alabama quarterback to do so. So I think there's something to be said about developing in a system and taking your time in doing so. There is one thing I want to touch on here, and I was going through the roster yesterday. Obviously, the news, Tyler Williams entering the transfer portal, not a huge shock there, the news of itself. But you look at this Georgia wide receiver room moving forward, they're losing a lot of guys off this team next year at that position, Jeff. I think
5 or 6. Yeah.
5 or 6, and that's before factoring in anyone that wants to potentially go into the transfer portal. How does having Ryan Montgomery, how does having that quarterback now solidified? Obviously JuJu would have attracted a lot of attention, especially being an in-state guy. But with guys like C.J. Wiley, Travis Smith, who you wrote about earlier this week, what does the wide receiver room look like now that Georgia has its quarterback in place?
Well, I think, to be fair, Brian is not very well known in the South, even though he's like what I've learned considered probably the greatest quarterback to come out of his little slice of Ohio. That's maybe an hour away from Toledo. Findlay is maybe Toledo is in maybe an hour outside Detroit. He's at a high school. I think it's interesting tidbit here where Ben Roethlisberger graduated and played his high school ball. And Ryan broke his single game passing record of 491 yards. And I believe another dual record of 6 touchdowns in a game. So it's an area which has produced some level of quarterback talent. You could say Ryan's probably the best high school passer because he's already got like obscene, like Madden Tecmo Bowl numbers a little bit with like over 89 career touchdown passes through 3 seasons. He really took a giant leap this past junior year when he got with an offensive coordinator that could really coach him up. They went spread, they went no huddle. And I think Ryan's a name that people are going to get used to, and they're going to say, I know a lot of people thought, and maybe a lot of people even among our team, Brandon, I didn't mean to say Brandon, but I kind of meant to say maybe some members of our team kind of wanted to see Georgia take the next step, and people have got rightfully to think so. I mean, there was a time, Connor, I'll be honest, when I kind of thought that what would Georgia look like with the best quarterback in the country on their side? And that's a pretty impressive thought to think about if you could mesh those two together. But the problem with that is I didn't think it was stable. It wasn't fickle. Like what good would it be for Julian Lewis to Pied Piper some 5-star receivers or some really high 5-star receivers if he might bold after a year or two? I think long term, that's what Georgia's got to think in terms of receivers. But one thing, Connor, I know a lot of people kind of kick the tires on this quarterback prospect here because they're like, oh, he's not only the number 15 quarterback when Zollers and Lewis are rated higher than him. And everybody's like, hey, the recruiting rankings either work and they matter or they don't matter. Well, Carson Beck was, for the most of his high school career, especially after his junior year, he was in a continual slide. He ended up like number 254 overall. So you've got Ryan at around 185, 170 across the 2 sites. I think that's pretty good. Another very interesting thing is when you get to college, really, I would say, Connor, that the only thing that a lot of these receivers care about. Are you going to give me a catchable ball? Are you going to give it to me on time? And are you going to give it to me a place where I can make a play? Ryan Montgomery was at the Future 50 a year ago. That's where they stack all the best rising juniors in the country to go compete. And he won the accuracy challenge of that event. And the mental side of Ryan Montgomery is going to be impressive, Connor. His own high school coach said it bordered on obsessive about how much he prepares, how meticulous he is preparing. Connor, I want to take you to this quote here. And this is something Ryan Montgomery told me back in January after a visit to Georgia, where it really felt like Georgia was going to be the spot for him, provided Georgia turned on the Krispy Kreme sign and said, let's go all in, ready to go. But he said this, and I think it was one of the more telling quotes I've ever taken from a recruit. It said, no matter where I go, my mentality going is I'm going to compete for the starting job. I'm going to get the starting job. Obviously, that's going to be super hard to do as a freshman, as a true freshman. You know, it is more likely that'll not happen at a place like Georgia, but that's just going to be my mentality going in. And I know if Georgia ends up being the place, if I don't start year 2 or year 1 or year 3, I think I will be perfectly fine knowing that I'm going to keep getting developed and keep getting those practice reps. And when my number is called and the time is right, I'm going to go out there and perform very well. Connor, I mean, that one right there kind of speaks as you want your quarterback to be cocky, you want him to be arrogant, but you also want him to realize what modern college football is like at the recruiting position for quarterbacks, and especially at a place like the University of Georgia. I felt like when I heard that, it almost sounded like that was exactly the dream script that Kirby Smart would like to hear out of one of his top flight quarterback recruits.
And I'll say to that point there, you know, he's got an older brother, Luke Montgomery, who I believe is going into his second year at Ohio State this season. So Ryan, in some understanding, knows what it is like to try and compete and win at a big level in college football, and I think that is going to help him tremendously. One thing you said, you know, you wonder what Georgia looks like if they have the best quarterback in the country. I think Carson Beck can be that this season, and I think the route that Beck has taken, I think, should lend some confidence into what Ryan Montgomery can ultimately be. Look, we've been following the sport of football, you know, over 100 years in this country. We still do not know how to consistently develop elite quarterbacks. Just anyone who watches the sport, you know, that's why the draft is such a crapshoot. Tom Brady is the greatest quarterback of all time. He was a 6th-round pick. Patrick Mahomes is currently the best quarterback playing football. He was a 3-star prospect coming out of high school there. So development takes all kinds of twists and turns. But I think with what you've seen from Georgia and in this position in particular, I think with Mike Bobo and Kirby Smart, who I think at this point has earned the benefit of the doubt, winning 2 national championships, positioning Georgia to win a 3rd, they know what they value in that quarterback position. And that's not to say that they don't value what JuJu Lewis could obviously bring to the table, but I think it's fair to point out there are a lot more strings attached to that recruitment there. I know JuJu can say that he prioritizes development, and by saying that you want to go play for Lincoln Riley, who is soon to have produced 3 number 1 draft picks and Heisman Trophy winners, I think that's a fair point to point out. But let's also not be naive here and factor in the NIL aspect that comes with this. And Kirby Smart has just shown that's not something that's going to matter a whole lot when it comes to what I look for in a quarterback. As you point out, Ryan Montgomery said that didn't matter in the slightest. And for a number of reasons, I think Ryan Montgomery is a great fit for Georgia. He's a guy, I think, wired similar to Ryan Puglisi, similar to Gunnar Stockton, who's going to do the things behind the scenes, as the quote that you just laid out, show that, hey, I'm going to prepare and train to be the number 1 guy. I know I might not be it, but I know all that rep and all that work is going to help me in the long run. I can't help but think back, you know, after the 2021 season where, you know, there was the thought that Carson might start that UAB game, and he doesn't. A lot of guys, quite frankly, would have crumbled. They would have looked to have gone elsewhere. They wouldn't have looked to continue their development. Carson did. Carson continued to get better. And then when we saw him really for the next time against Vanderbilt in 2022, he looked like a significantly better quarterback. And I think that performance gave a lot of people reason to believe that he could ultimately be a successful starter for Georgia. He did that last season. And so when you look at quarterbacks moving forward for Georgia, I think that ability to keep wanting to get better all the time, you hear the people in the program say, how can I get 1% better today? I think Ryan Montgomery fits that ideal in that line of thinking to a T.
And let's also make sure we do this, Connor. Let's do our diligence here. It's not like Georgia is taking the island of misfit toys quarterbacks here. Yes, they've got a great fit in Ryan Montgomery, but dude, just like 3 weeks ago, they got the number one quarterback in the class of 2026. So, yeah, you've got Montgomery as a nice puzzle piece with the Tetris right here in 2025. And, oh, yeah, dude, you've got the number one quarterback in the country for 2026. I think that is very important. I think this is a very good way to coexist here with Curtis as opposed to Lewis coming in perhaps, and then everybody just saying, let's just get after it. May the best man win. There might only be one or two scholarship quarterbacks left at Georgia if Julian Lewis and Jared Curtis were on campus at the same time. But kind of let's do this right now. I know maybe the warden Brandon is away, so let's have some fun. I know we like to try to be highbrow reporters here. I'm going to have a real discussion with you here. And what I'm going to say is, I know it's sometimes reckless and speculative for us to dabble in the theater of NIL, but I think it's out there. Mm-hmm. And I know you know a lot about the NFL draft, roster construction, and even at some point, even if Georgia's payroll eventually ends up being $15 to $20 million a year for its football team, which is, you've heard Ryan Day already say that a little bit in no uncertain terms. Connor, do you rather have to go spend a lot of dollars at the quarterback position, or do you want to take maybe a good fit here with Ryan and then maybe earmark those dollars for five-star defensive lineman here, five-star defensive lineman there? How do you feel about that?
It's obvious at a college game where there is still, I think, the physical differences on a team-by-team basis, and with what you saw, how Georgia has won their 2 national championships, and even Michigan with this most recent championship. If you just have bigger and better dudes on the lines of scrimmage, that's still, in my opinion, the way to go about winning a national championship. Yes, Alabama won a lot in late, Tua Tagovailoa, obviously, with their 2017 national championship. But that program in Alabama was built on being dominant on both the offensive line and the defensive line. I think you're going to see Georgia continue to do that. And so now with Ryan Montgomery in the fold, it becomes, okay, how do you go about securing the commitment of 5-star defensive lineman Elijah Griffith? How do you go about securing the 5-star commitment of, say, David Sanders? How do you go about building out those trenches there, flipping Justice Terry from USC? I think that's the big step that Georgia is going to continue to look for. You've already seen some freshmen from this most recent class come in, Daniel Calhoun, Joseph Jonah-Ajayi. I think with Georgia continuing to want to build on the lines of scrimmage, look, NIL matters, but I think Carson Beck is the perfect example of this, and yes, he came up in a time where NIL was not a factor in his recruitment, but he comes in, waits his turn, earns his starting reps, selects to come back for a senior year. And that's when the riches really start pouring in after he has proved it and his profile is so much higher. I think when you look at from a high school recruiting standpoint, offensive and defensive linemen, just quite frankly, they're not going to earn as much in the long run because of the fact that they just don't play the quarterback position there. So I think if you're trying to budget your money and allocate things around, you're okay paying more up front for those offensive and defensive linemen, knowing they're not going to cost you as much in the long run, while also knowing and understanding that they're just a more valuable resource because there are less of those guys who are 6'5", 275 pounds as an 18-year-old. Whereas quarterback, look, we've seen a lot of different people go out there and develop at that quarterback position. It comes in all shapes and sizes. Jake Fromm, Stetson Bennett, Carson Beck, all won a lot of games at Georgia, and all are very, very different players. So I think while, yes, you understand why someone like a JuJu Lewis attracts such an NIL money offer, and look, I'll put this out there right now because I know I wrote a story about it, and then JuJu had the tweet about it. When your dad comes out and says that, hey, I think my son is worth $500,000 in NIL as a high school player, that's just unfortunately going to attract a certain stigma to you throughout your career. And so, look, quarterbacks have a right to seek as much NIL money as they want, just as anyone else does. But I think Georgia is right about going out and prioritizing, say, offensive and defensive linemen when it comes to NIL. Which let's not beat around the bush here. They are competitive when it comes to NIL in that regard, but they're not going to break the bank and make one player such a priority, especially when they know depth is what really wins them national championships.
Connor, I think it's a matter of Georgia kind of holding the line to the philosophy of that. Your very best players and most experienced players should be getting the most NIL. I think that's how you preserve culture. I think that's how you preserve chemistry, and I think that's how they preserve a locker room. Connor, the thinking about developing and evaluating quarterbacks is precise. No one really does it well. I think Kirby Smart in Georgia and Mike Bobo, and previous to that, Todd Monken, they go, how do you really figure out if you got a good quarterback? Well, how about this? Let's let him face 15 future NFL players on defense. Let's let him do that for 2 years, probably before he plays for us. And you know what? He can move the ball down the field. If he can avoid that awful play, if he can play winning football for Georgia in that environment, that's a pretty good sample size in terms of, I mean, hey, how do you know these guys are good when they get to the NFL and they face NFL players? I make the opinion here that I think Georgia's portion of its roster is more NFL laden than just about anybody else in the country. I'm sure Ohio State fans can bark. Alabama fans can still bark about that a little bit. And I also look at it in terms of, Connor, we have to include, that's why I didn't feel it was too reckless to talk a little bit about the NIL space here. Connor, I feel we have to include the fact that a lot of these dollars, I mean, I don't know about you, Connor, but when you were at G-Day on Saturday, did you see the multiple messages from Kirby Smart? There are billboards up and down Athens Highway now talking about NIL, Elite, Georgia, go to the website. I think the way you preserve what Georgia's built so far is you not only earmark more and more of those dollars to roster retention, the Ellis Robinsons, the KJ Boldens, the Chris Coles, the Joseph Jonah Ajanyes, the guys that just came in that are eventually going to say, hey, man, I played really well my freshman year. I think you earmark more of those funds towards that. Then in the high school space, you're really doing the right thing with that.
And you've seen it time and time again. Look, I did the numbers today. Of the 86 players currently projected to be on Georgia's roster next year, 59 of them will either be in their first or second year in the program. It's just harder and harder to keep guys around. And so I think Georgia's absolutely right in trying to, as you point out, prioritize roster retention and keep guys on the roster rather than trying to bring in new guys each year. Because, look, we'll bring up a Wire quote in here. After year one, who's to say that whoever that high priority quarterback is doesn't come in and say, hey, and the price of the brick just went up. So I think moving forward, look, when it comes to NIL, and I think that's so important when talking about this. And I think it's a reason why Ryan Montgomery is ultimately a quarterback at the University of Georgia, because they know that Ryan Montgomery values the same things that they do. And that's not to say that Julian Lewis doesn't, but it's clear where Ryan Montgomery's priorities always lied. And I think you saw Georgia wanting to get in with Ryan Montgomery, answer a lot of questions, because around quarterback, not just recruiting moving forward, but in the transfer portal. I know you and I have talked about this off air. Kirby Smart said that he's wanted to get to 4 scholarship quarterbacks. I just don't know how that's feasible, where you find a guy that you believe is good enough to want to develop into a starting quarterback at a place like the University of Georgia, where he is good enough to do that, while also having him come in and sit a year behind Carson Beck. It just, at this point in the portal, it becomes very difficult, in my opinion, to find someone who checks all those boxes. I know Ja'Cory Brown out of Miami just entered the portal recently, a guy from the state of Georgia, played at Lowndes High School. There was some thought maybe there. But in talking about the transfer portal and the quarterback room moving forward, I think in landing Ryan Montgomery, it brings a great deal of stability back to that quarterback position that really, starting with the Arch Manning recruitment back in the 2023 cycle and not landing him, and Georgia not taking a quarterback, there's been a lot of, changing of lanes, so to speak, in terms of figuring out how to get the most number of bodies in their quarterback room. They land Ryan Puglisi, then they try and land Dylan Raiola. He flips at the last minute. They try and take Jaden Maeva out of the transfer portal. And they rearrange their board in 2025 because of that. So now I think with Montgomery in the fold, with Curtis lined up, you get sort of back into a more normalized setting when it comes to quarterbacks moving forward. And there's less of this worry of how do we get to enough healthy bodies, because when Ryan Puglisi didn't play on Saturday at G-Day, and then you remember that Carson Beck's probably gone after this year, man, having 2 scholarship quarterbacks is not a place where you want to be, because especially with someone like Gunnar, who plays the way that he does, where he likes to run around and create with his legs. Yeah. You saw it with Jake Fromm in 2019 when Fromm and Stetson Bennett were the only quarterbacks. Georgia was so handicapped by what they would be willing to do there, because if Jake takes one wrong hit, you're in a real bad spot there. So I think the landing of Ryan Montgomery does factor somewhat into the transfer portal with this quarterback position, and at the very least helps bring some stability to where this position is going forward in the future.
Yeah, Connor, I'm glad you wrote about that this week. I think here's where I know it's working. I think if you take away, and you can answer this question really readily, if you take away Warren Brinson and you take away Nazir Stackhouse and then Michael Williams as well, what's left in the Georgia defensive line room?
Not a whole lot.
Tyrion Ingram Dawkins, the rest of them are all freshmen or redshirt freshmen.
Yep.
And then look at the offensive side of the ball, like that, which is considered the strength of the team. You've got Xavier Truss showed up in 2019 in Athens. Jared Wilson was 2021. Tate Ratledge was 2020. Ernest Green III was 2022. Micah Morris was 2021.
Yep.
Dylan Fairchild was 2021. Is there any reason why Georgia's offensive line is really good and it is overpowering the young boys right now? It's pretty simple. It's the 22-year-old kid versus the 18-year-old kid right there. And I think that's what you do. Like, I see people and like, listen, Julian is going to play great football in college. Julian's probably going to do sort of what Bryce Young did, maybe what Caleb Williams did. They're going to be a Heisman Trophy candidate. They're going to put up a ton of stats if it's in the Lincoln Riley offense. And if he stays in the Lincoln Riley system, he'll probably be picked number 1 in about 3 or 4 years. But, more power to the Lewis family, because that's what they want. That's what they design as a successful college career. You have others that don't feel that way. The University of Georgia's number one thing with signing quarterbacks is not to have them pick number 1 overall in the draft. Carson Beck might be able to rise to that level this year, but their number one thing is, how does this guy help us prepare to win big football games? That's on the practice field first, and that's getting an earful of chewings from Kirby Smart over the microphone for about 2 years, and that's psychological warfare. And then you're going to be ready to go and take on Auburn, take on Tennessee, take on those hostile crowds in the SEC. So when you sit there and say, I want folks to consider this. When they sit there and say, okay, this means we're not getting JuJu? Yeah, it probably means that. But it also means that you're probably more likely to have a class that includes a Justice Terry, an Elias Williams, an Elijah Griffin, a David Sanders, because those guys they're not going to attract quarterback NIL collective efforts, but they're going to attract some sort of efforts in this free enterprise system we've got right now. So if you want to couch this up, maybe this is what I'm going to call it. This is a win for the Georgia football program, because it's a long-term benefit for Georgia to keep doing what it's been doing.
All right, Jeff, we don't want to keep you too long. We also know you have your own show tonight, Before the Hedges, 8 p.m. You're going to be breaking down all this post-G-Day visits, a lot of visitors in town. But in wrapping things up on Ryan Montgomery, what is Georgia getting, and how does he help Georgia continue to potentially contend for and win national championships?
He's that guy that's going to be there preparing. He's going to be there in the film room at 11 o'clock at night. He's going to be that guy that great story. We've heard from Cedric Von Granger before. Cedric was in the film room looking at film, and he's texting Stet, and he's like, hey, man, about this right here with this call and this look, why don't we do this? And he texts him that thought. And then about a minute later, he doesn't get a reply. He has Stetson walking into the film room, and he's like, hey, dummy, I'm here too. I'm just in the other room. I'm watching film just like you are. So I think that's the type of guy Georgia's bringing in. Recruiting rankings are what they are. It's a commodity, but you're talking about a top 200 prospect, number 15 quarterback in the country. His brother was an All-American in high school, and he's at Ohio State of all places. This family gets it, and they get college football. And let me use another high school metaphor to close it out, Connor. This is the most likely to succeed quarterback at Georgia coming and joining the Bulldogs today.
I didn't get voted that at high school, but I'm sure you got a few votes thrown your way there, Jeff. So thank you so much for joining us here. Make sure to check out his show tonight, Before the Hedges, 8 p.m. I'm going to have a ton more on this. Brandon Adams unable to join us today. He'll, I'm sure, have thoughts on this tomorrow morning on DawgNation Daily. We've got DawgNation at large tomorrow afternoon as well. Ryan Montgomery, Georgia has its quarterback for the 2025 recruiting cycle. 4-star quarterback out of Findlay, Ohio. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. This has been a DawgNation production.